And a lot of times we feel really frustrated and ashamed of ourselves because we can't just get over it. But that's not really possible. It's not a choice. If it was a choice, everyone would make it.
Hey guys, welcome back to the First Hustle Then Brunch podcast. I'm your host Jazzy, and today we are wrapping up the Domestic Violence Awareness Month series with an episode on healing after an abusive relationship. Yes, it is December and this series started in October, but a lot has been going on. I obviously told you guys my story, part of it at least, and there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes. So I took some time off to honestly rest, and obviously, as you'll hear in this episode, it's very important to prioritize self-care as you're healing. So with that being said, I'm really excited to finally share this episode. I'm speaking with Emmy Marie, who is a certified trauma-informed somatic coach who specializes in helping clients create thriving lives and relationships after trauma. As an abuse survivor herself, Emmy understands the devastation trauma can have on our lives and is committed to helping as many people as possible access their power and heal from trauma. Honestly, re-listening to this episode again has helped me, given, like I said, it's been a very, very tough several weeks. So, I know this is going to help so many people. So let's go ahead and dive in. Hey, Emmy, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me for such an important discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you share a little bit about your personal journey and what led you to become a trauma recovery coach?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the work that I do is really connected to my personal story and life experience. When I was a teenager in high school, I got into kind of like my first love type relationship that ended up being highly abusive. And it went on for 3 years, kind of getting escalatingly worse over the course of that time. And I was really just convinced that, this was the guy I loved and we were meant to be together, and there really didn't feel like there was any way out for me. So that went on, and it was, if you look up kind of narcissistic abusive relationship, that's typically what will, give you a summary of what that looks like if people want to understand that better. But just various types of lots of emotional, verbal, sexual, occasionally physical abuse. And at the same time, I was trying to pretend it wasn't happening. So I was trying to project an image to everyone around me that I was fine and we were in a happy relationship and all was well. So I kind of was basically living this double life where, my days were filled with terror and pain. But I didn't really let anyone see that because it didn't feel safe to do so. So that went on for 3 years, like I mentioned. And then I left that relationship, kind of like a miracle moment, got out of it. And then soon later went to college and didn't really do any healing work whatsoever. I just kind of thought the idea was to just get over it and move on, trying to like take advice from people who are just, magazines, books, whatever, that was geared toward just moving on from a normal like heartbreak maybe. So I didn't really understand, how traumatic this was going to be. I thought it was over, so then I should just get over it. So I went to college and just basically started kind of repeating this pattern where I'm looking for guys who are very emotionally unavailable. I don't have any self-worth whatsoever to expect being treated well by someone, and just like having a really anxious attachment style, looking for someone else to complete me. Ended up in another relationship at the end of my freshman year of college that lasted for 2 years. And while it wasn't nearly as bad as the one before, it was still very dysfunctional, and I was certainly not happy in it. And so I didn't really understand I deserved better, and really every problem that came up, I would just blame on myself. And so after that, also ended in kind of an explosive ending. I realized, I have to stop doing this. Like, I need to change how I am in relationships. It was like a big wake-up call. And then at the same time, my complex PTSD symptoms started getting really bad because I was finally not like immersed in the dynamic that I needed to like manage. So I was kind of in a safer environment and like relational space. And so all of these symptoms of trauma started emerging, which made me kind of forced to get therapy because it was hard to function. So I finally went to therapy. This is now over almost 4 years after the first relationship ended. And that kind of began my healing journey, which now has been going on for 7 years or so. And yeah, so I've done a lot of work. I spent a lot of time focusing on myself and feeling safe in my body and really learning everything I could about trauma because it was fascinating to me. And obviously I was trying to help myself. And then a couple years into that process, I got the feeling that, I can support other people in some capacity. Like I got to a point where I felt safe enough in my body and able to, regulate myself enough that helping other people was always calling for me, but now it felt more possible. And so my Instagram account originally was just me creating content, kind of like a journal that I just shared on there because it was a nice way to contain it. And then it started kind of picking up traction, and the dominoes kind of fell, and I realized like coaching was a field that could allow me to help folks with my experience and with my knowledge. So I got some certifications in trauma-informed coaching and later some other ones throughout the past years. But yeah, I've been doing this full time now for over 3 years, supporting other survivors on their quest to thrive after traumatic experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I feel like a lot of survivors can relate to what you've said. Pretty much everything you said, starting with living a double life, where these things are happening to you behind the scenes and you're not letting other people see it. Cause I definitely did that too. And it's really hard to kind of hide that. So I love that you kind of used your own story and testimony to start helping other people. And it's crazy how social media these days connects us, with people all over the world in similar situations. And then you don't feel so alone, because I feel like this is very isolating.
Right.
It can be. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it was my first motivation was to not feel alone myself. And then that slowly morphed into helping other people not feel alone because, it's one of the most like destructive things that can happen is being isolated. Abusers tend to intentionally isolate their victims for a reason. And then unfortunately, kind of the world we live in doesn't really support a lot of connection for trauma survivors. So I've kind of taken it upon myself, and I'm absolutely not the only one, but it's a big part of my mission to kind of go against that and be like, guess what? You're not alone. And here's like community and resources to support your healing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I also commend you for even speaking up and like sharing your story publicly, because that's really hard to begin with. But there's also like the stigma of like, you don't talk about the trauma and things that have happened to you in the past, that have hurt you. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So what exactly is trauma? I want to make sure we kind of lay the foundation for, getting everybody on the same page of what it is. And then what are some common signs that survivors might experience that they're not even realizing are trauma,
Yeah. So trauma has a lot of different definitions, but essentially trauma is the result of an experience or multiple chronic experiences where we have a sense of threat that is beyond our ability to cope with because we don't have the resources or the support, or it's just way too overwhelming for our bodies to kind of integrate and cope with. And so, there's situations that two people could experience and one person goes on to develop trauma and the other person doesn't. And that might be because one person doesn't have social support, the other person does. Or for one person, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And for the other person, their life is generally very safe and okay. And this was like a one incident that they were able to, heal from. And so a lot of the people I work with, and I see a lot of, orient more towards having complex trauma. And what that comes from more chronic, long-term situations such as developmental trauma. So stuff that happens in your childhood, perhaps abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, bullying, religious abuse, medical trauma. Like there's a whole list that we don't really need to go into. But another definition I really like is trauma is the result of our needs going chronically unmet. And so that can include so many things, because when we think of needs, you think about, we all have a need for physical safety. So if your need for physical safety goes unmet one time, you might develop PTSD. Like, for example, I got in a really bad car accident when I was 16. I actually didn't really get PTSD from that, but I could have, right? And that would have been more of a general PTSD that's like, maybe I would be terrified of driving and have nightmares about it. But then with complex PTSD is those needs are being unmet kind of over and over and over. So in my abusive relationship, every single person on earth has a need to feel safe emotionally, that they can be themselves, and the people that say they love them are going to treat them with care and respect generally. No one's ever perfect, but it's like a general pattern that people are kind, respectful, connecting.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a relationship or with a family and you are constantly getting this message that you need to censor who you are, change who you are, be better, or they're going to hurt you, or they're going to leave you, or something bad is going to happen to you. If that happens over and over and over again, it can develop into more of a complex trauma experience. And so some of the symptoms you might notice with both PTSD and complex PTSD, or just complex trauma, would be things like re-experiencing. So nightmares, flashbacks, vivid, intrusive memories. You might also have a hard time with emotional dysregulation. So feeling like maybe your emotional responses to things are dramatic, quote unquote, or just like out of alignment with what the actual situation is. You might also notice hypervigilance, where you feel like you're, kind of paranoid, or always like looking for a threat to arise, and you're never really safe. And you also might try to avoid things that trigger you. But then with complex trauma, there's this added element of it can impact your belief systems. It can impact how you view yourself, what you believe about relationships, like all these elements of personality, because this experience happened over and over and over and kind of shaped the way you see the world and yourself. So it can add this whole other element that regular PTSD might not touch at all. Like with regular PTSD, you might be like, yeah, like I know I'm like a good person, I'm just terrified of driving, or for example. With the complex PTSD, it can be more like there's something wrong with me, like I'm inherently bad, or some of those beliefs that long-term traumatic experiences can teach us.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. I didn't even realize until recently that there were two different types of PTSD. You hear PTSD, like that umbrella term, I guess, is the main one, but the complex aspect of it, that's really interesting. I know that, dealing with abuse and trauma can definitely impact your self-worth and like your beliefs, but I didn't realize that can be considered PTSD or complex PTSD.
Right. Right. And I mean, I think it's important to name that, like, first of all, I can't diagnose anyone, period, but especially through a podcast. And like relating to some of the stuff I'm saying doesn't mean that you necessarily qualify for a diagnosis, nor does doing this kind of healing work mean that you have to have one of those diagnoses. So for example, I've done so much healing that now I don't really have any of those PTSD symptoms generally. Like, sure, I get triggered once in a while, but like most days I feel generally safe, able to regulate my emotions, like a healthy person. But some of the stuff that I'm working on now is like basically like getting in touch with grief and sadness, because I've had a wall up for so long where it's like it's not safe to feel sad, or else like that's just so connected to my trauma. So it's like that's just kind of like the nuance with that, where it's like I'm a fully functioning person. I probably wouldn't qualify for a diagnosis at this point, but there's absolutely still things about my trauma that are impacting me today. So yeah, it's just like, I don't really believe in like gatekeeping trauma, and it seems like if people relate to it, then maybe they want to engage with some healing resources without necessarily being like mentally ill, quote unquote.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, there's that stigma too, people might avoid this topic or even looking into it or feeling like they should, go to therapy or whatever because they don't want to be deemed mentally ill or whatever. So yeah,
totally.
That's a good point.
Right. And that's really sad. Yeah. There's like so many reasons why that's problematic, but yeah, I feel like kind of normalizing that trauma exists for so many people is really helpful, because then maybe it's less overwhelming to just even accept like, oh, okay. Like I know for a lot of people, like getting into a new relationship can be like, all of a sudden you start noticing all these things where you're like, whoa, that actually has to do with my relationship from 3 years ago, not this person I'm dating.
Yeah.
And does that mean you have PTSD? No. But, that's kind of like what trauma-informed education and support looks like, is understanding like, oh, in the past, this thing happened. And so that's why it's showing up today.
Yeah.
And kind of working with that.
Yeah, makes sense. So what are some of the coping mechanisms that you've seen people use to deal with trauma? I know you have that quiz on your site about the different masks people wear. I actually took it.
Yeah.
I got overachiever,
nice.
which I honestly was not surprised
Nice.
about. I was like, yeah,
Nice.
sounds about right.
Yeah, word. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I'll go ahead and just kind of touch on those, since that's a good way to look at it. So yeah, you're referencing this quiz that I have, which basically I present like 5 different, I'm calling masks, but you could also call coping strategies or personality traits that folks who have experienced trauma might develop to try to cope with their experiences. So with the overachiever, you might notice yourself like pushing yourself super, super hard, like always wanting to be the best, having really high expectations for yourself, and staying really busy. And all of that can be a way of trying to prove that you are good enough if something in the past made you feel like you weren't, unless you were the best. Similar to that, I think, is the perfectionist, with some differences where a perfectionist might be focused more on everything being like absolutely flawless or like by the book, by the rules, versus an overachiever is more focusing on being the best or, earning external achievements. But very similar, kind of this really intense pressure on yourself to be better than any human being could possibly be. You think that you're the exception and you need to never make a mistake. And maybe when those mistakes happen, you're really, really hard on yourself. All of this could have to do with like something in the past that taught you perfection is the only option, or maybe you were praised for being perfect, or being an overachiever. Then there's the one that was the most common result so far, which is the people pleaser. And so a ton of people relate to this. And there's also overlap. Like I relate to all of these things I'm talking about at different times in my life. But with the people pleaser, you probably learned at some point that in order to stay safe or to belong or to, get through life as best as possible, you need to make sure other people are happy with you or other people are happy in general. So you kind of live your life with this perspective of, I need to ensure that the person that I'm, with in some capacity is happy with me. So how can I do that? Probably by shifting my needs, sacrificing my boundaries, like just contorting myself into whoever they want me to be. And so that can definitely keep you safe, but at, a high cost, once again, of compromising your own sense of safety sometimes, or your own just well-being in order to try to make someone else happy. And then another one I call the peacemaker. So this is someone who maybe thinks that having needs is a burden that they don't want to put on others, and just tries to, kind of go through life making as little ripples as possible. They might have learned in the past that their opinion wasn't welcome, that they shouldn't speak up, that they need to, kind of keep it small and quiet in order to stay safe. So they are probably the person that always says, I don't care, like whatever, it's up to you, but deep inside might be neglecting parts of themselves that really want to speak their truth. And then the final one I talk about is hyper independence, which can go along with a lot of these, but someone who's hyper independent might have a really hard time ever relying on anyone else for anything. So maybe in the past they learned that relying on other people would only lead to pain or neglect or abandonment. And so they responded to that by saying, I only need myself. I'm not going to trust anyone else. I'm just going to take care of me. And this can absolutely keep someone safe, but at the cost of, experiencing real authentic connection with others. So yeah, those are some of the ways that trauma, I think, can impact our personality, or how people, shift and mold their personality to cope with experiences that were traumatic.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And you're right. You can definitely relate to multiple of those, I feel like, at different times.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, so I know you mentioned that you've been on your healing journey for the past 7 years. So what are some common misconceptions or expectations people have about healing, and like what that's supposed to look like?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think the biggest kind of misconception is like what I kind of said earlier was basically like you should be able to just get over something, or that time heals everything. And
Yeah.
so I think when something is painful but not traumatic, time absolutely heals things. Like I've had breakups in my past that were really devastating to me, but there wasn't any trauma involved. It was just painful. And time took that away, as well as with, support and stuff. But eventually there came a day where I was like, wow, this isn't like super painful to me anymore. Like I've accepted it.
Yeah.
But with trauma, there is changes to our nervous systems, to our brains. Like you can read about all that research. It's really fascinating, but time doesn't just make things better. And so anyone that's been traumatized can attest to this. And a lot of times we feel really frustrated and ashamed of ourselves because we can't just get over it. But that's not really possible. It's not a choice. If it was a choice, everyone would make it, immediately.
Yeah.
So, I think just like that informs my really strong belief in self-acceptance and self-compassion, and also having compassion for other people, of course. But when you're the one that's experiencing this, being gentle with yourself and giving yourself a lot of time and patience. I think that's a big misconception about trauma.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's a big one. And, it's external. Other people say, you should be over this by now. Like, why are you still thinking about this? But I feel like we can also do it to ourselves. It's like, okay, well,
Exactly.
I should be over this. It happened months ago or years ago. Why am I still so hung up on this? So, yeah, I feel like
exactly
you can kind of get down on yourself too, which, yeah.
Totally. Right. Yeah, I feel like that's like the biggest one that really encompasses a lot. And that's what's coming to me for now.
Yeah. So can you explain the difference between triggers and like red flags?
Yeah, so there's like a tremendous amount of overlap with these, but as far as like defining the words, red flag would be something that you see in a relationship with another human that cues you into the fact that it's not a safe relationship to be in, or maybe it's just not what you're wanting. I feel like there's kind of different definitions. Like a red flag is like, whoa, watch out, this is not safe. Or it might just mean like maybe a beige flag or a yellow flag or something is more like, I'm not so sure about that. Like, if that's going to work for me, it doesn't mean this person's bad, but like, that's just not my thing.
Right.
So I'm just going to go ahead and speak to the safety aspect. So a red flag would something that signals to you this person isn't trustworthy or not safe. And then a trigger is something that happens when something that you're experiencing reminds you of a past situation in which you were harmed or really terrified or developed trauma from. And so what happens with these things is when you get into a relationship, or when you're in one in general, but especially I think at the beginning, you might be looking out for red flags, learning more information about this person, trying to get to know them better. And with trauma, it's really easy to sometimes ignore red flags because you're essentially used to chaos, fear, pain, dysfunction. That becomes normal if that's been a part of your history. And so you might go into a relationship and just miss all of the red flags because you're like, yeah, this is normal. This is what relationships are like. So that definitely happened to me in that second relationship I was talking about, where I was just like, I'm used to being anxious and upset, and I'm just going to ignore all those things and focus on like the giddiness of like getting into something new and like having someone choose me and all that stuff. And so a red flag should be not necessarily triggering, but like, an alarm bell or something.
Right.
But a lot of times we miss that, like I said, because we're used to it. And then with triggers, when you are in a relationship with another human and you're someone that has trauma, it's highly likely that they are eventually going to trigger you at some point, even if it's like the smell of their deodorant or how long they take to respond to a text or something totally benign, but it's something that, can set off this feeling of like, I'm not safe or something's wrong, or, it can lead to like, what's wrong with me? It can lead to what's wrong with them, but just sort of like some story starts getting told because our body is remembering something from the past. And so sometimes a red flag is triggering, sometimes it's not, but I just think those things are something it's important to build like discernment about and understanding about, because if you get into a new relationship and someone is really wonderful, but they accidentally trigger you, and it's like I said, something that's not real, quote unquote.
Right.
It's not actually a red flag. And then you run away or leave the relationship or just start hating yourself for it. That can be really destructive if you have the goal to connect to other humans or, maintain a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
So that's why I think those topics are important.
Yeah, for sure. So red flags are to alert you. The triggers aren't necessarily someone else's fault, like,
Right.
yeah.
If someone triggers you because they're treating you poorly,
Right.
that's
Yeah, very
appropriate.
different.
Like you should
Yeah.
be triggered by that, and hopefully, then it comes down to, okay, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to, have a conversation with them? Are you going to walk away, or are you going to ignore how you're feeling and people please or whatever? And so that's what we want to avoid
Yeah.
to keep you safe and like aligned with what feels healthy and right for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know you talk a lot about breaking the cycle of trauma. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so what I am referring to when I talk about breaking the cycle is the cycle of trauma being kind of a set of patterns, beliefs, behaviors that originate from something traumatic that you went through. So a cycle that I was on, like I mentioned earlier, is choosing partners who are really emotionally unavailable or even, toxic or harmful because I just really wanted to be chosen and I also didn't understand that I deserved better. So that was kind of a cycle that trauma got me on. And then breaking that is ultimately deciding to stop it, So it's not just stopping it like on a behavioral level, but like deciding, it's a lot of inner work of like, I deserve something better than this. Something better than this is even possible. Kind of, it feels like a quest to me where you're going out and you're saying, there's so much unknown here, but I have the intention. I want to break the cycle. I want something better for me. What do I need to support myself with that process? But yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm learning that trauma, a lot of it is generational. Like it just gets passed down and passed down because it's like, oh, well, especially with abusers, you hear this a lot. Like, was his father abusive? Did he experience it in his family? And it's like, okay, well, there's like this history of abuse that's been passed down and they're just kind of used to it at this point, So
Right.
I think it's so important.
Totally. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Right. Breaking the cycle can be breaking a legacy of trauma that was passed down to you through your family or through a group you're in or something like that. And choosing to kind of walk away from that is like a really powerful and radical act and very difficult.
Yeah, for sure. So when starting your healing journey, say you leave an abusive relationship like this, what does that look like? What's the first step? Like, where can people begin?
Right. Yeah. So I think the most important thing to do is get yourself support. So that can be, resources like that you find online, books, podcasts. Certainly therapy is a really great thing, but I know not everyone can access that or wants to. Finding support with people you trust. Like I have lots of groups and stuff if that's more your approach rather than reaching out to friends, like if that's less comfortable. But yeah, getting supported, perhaps definitely taking the time to process what you went through. So this is once again where, therapy comes in really well, but there's certainly other ways to process depending on what you like, what resonates with you. Some people can be really express themselves with creativity. Other people, it's more like movement, some form of expression. And yeah, like there's so many different ways this process can go, but ultimately I think giving yourself time to, rest, recuperate, heal, filling up your cup with things that bring you joy and remind you of your inherent worth as a human being, or also things that allow you to feel safe. So creating the conditions for safety in your life that you probably haven't had if you've been in an abusive relationship. Focusing a lot on safety, I think, is super important.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess for any family and friends that are listening to this episode, how can they support survivors, without re-traumatizing them or making them feel judged? I know that when I left, like people wanted to help me and I think they just didn't know what to say or what to do. So yeah, do you have any advice for them?
Totally. Yeah, I feel like the number one best thing to do is kind of ask someone what they're wanting. So instead of assuming you need to fix someone's problems or make them feel better or expecting them to tell you the whole story or something like that, saying something like, I know you just got through something really, really hard and scary. Like, I am here for you. Do you want to talk about it? If so, I'm a listening ear. If you want my perspective or advice, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just kind of hold space for you and be there to help you as much as I can. And then, if there's someone that doesn't want to talk about it, like seeing, like, do you want to do something that feels fun? Do you want to do something that feels really cozy? Like, how can I best show up for you? Yeah, I think just making yourself available without putting pressure on someone to like have to tell you about it, I guess, is really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and listening when they do want to share something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's huge. I did not want to talk about it at the beginning. It's like, it was so
Totally.
difficult. I don't even know the words to describe it. And yeah,
Right.
you're kind of reliving that trauma when you share the stories
Yeah.
of what happened before. So yeah, I appreciated the people that just like let me talk whenever I was comfortable. And sometimes I ended up sharing probably way more than, they even thought I would, just because they gave me that space to just speak freely, as I was comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was awesome.
Yeah.
And then community
For
too.
sure.
That is so important, looking for support groups.
Yeah.
I actually knew, sadly, this is very common. So I knew some other people that had been in a similar situation and kind of reached out to them to say, what helped
Totally.
you? Like, point me in the right
Yeah.
direction, what the
Yeah.
resources, the information, I need to know,
Totally.
everything. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, that's why I'm like very grateful for the honestly like the online presence of this stuff. Like you can type in, abusive relationship healing on Instagram or whatever, and like so many resources will come up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like just reading social media posts isn't, gonna lead to healing by itself, but
Yeah.
it's a great place to go for just feeling like there are resources. I'm not helpless. I'm not hopeless. Like there
Mm-hmm.
is other people out there that have been through this. Yeah. So
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
grateful for that.
Yeah. Won't feel so alone.
Right.
Yeah, so I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but abuse can impact people's sense of self-worth. So how can survivors go about rebuilding their self-esteem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think number one is being in relationships of all kinds that mirror back your inherent worth and value and and respect you as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like we heal best through kind of experiences, and so being in the room or being in a relationship of any kind. Sometimes it's professional relationships. Sometimes it's with your family, your friends. Like it's going to be different for everyone. But finding people that just naturally show to you that you are worthy of respect and care can be completely life changing and saving ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's one thing for building that self-esteem up is getting that direct experience. Some other things would be finding resources that speak to you, whether that's like spirituality type books, different kinds of self-help books, finding hobbies or interests that make you feel good about yourself, that make you feel joyful or relaxed or bring you pleasure. Just finding things that you like to do and indulging in those, or not just indulging, practicing those with a
Mm-hmm.
lot of intention of like, I am allowed to do nice things for myself. I'm allowed to feel good. I'm allowed to take care of myself. I'm allowed to receive care. Yeah, all of those are really great ways of kind of rebuilding something that was destroyed in
Mm-hmm.
a traumatic relationship, perhaps.
Yeah. I know a lot of people can relate to this too of, when you're in abusive relationships, sometimes you just completely lose yourself and you stop doing the things that you loved before because
Totally.
maybe they're keeping you away from
Right.
that activity or, they make fun of you every time you talk about something that you
Yeah.
like or whatever, for whatever reason. And so
Yeah.
getting back to that really, really helps, especially for me. I know, speaking for myself, like
Yeah.
getting back to the things that I loved, it was just like, oh, okay, I feel so much better now. It's kind of crazy how
Absolutely.
quickly that shift can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like so important to reclaim things that were kind of stolen away from you, whether it's because they were directly forcing you to stop or belittling you for doing something, or you just didn't have time anymore because you were so busy trying to survive that you
Mm-hmm.
what's a hobby when you're trying to make someone not hurt you every day? It's like, it doesn't matter anymore because you're so focused on survival. So
Yeah,
getting out of
so
that
true.
and being like, wow, I'm allowed to actually prioritize the things I care about again is like, yeah, really amazing and
Yeah.
healing.
Yeah, so true. So let's talk a little bit about love and relationships after leaving an abusive partner. So, first,
Yeah.
how do you know when you've healed enough to move on and start dating again? I feel like I hear this a lot of like either,
It's a
oh my
good
gosh,
question.
they moved on so fast, or like I feel
Yeah.
like I'm never going to date again because I don't want to be traumatized
Right.
by another
Right.
person.
Right. Yeah, it's so easy to go to one extreme or the other. So for full transparency, I've been like a serial monogamous, you could say, where every time a relationship ended, I was in a new one after like 2 weeks. Which, looking back now is wild. But at the time, I had a
Right, I
very,
don't judge,
very
yeah.
anxious attachment style. Yeah, like I just needed someone to make me feel complete. So I was kind of always on the like prowl. And that's how I ended up in such shitty relationships because I just kind of accepted anything that would come my way. And so I've now been in a relationship for 7 years that is very healthy. And I hope that's obvious. And I met him, pretty. It had been 6 months since my last like toxic relationship, so that's a good thing to note. And not even 6 months, like 5. I don't know. But looking back, like I feel like it's less about having like a hard rule when it comes to this, and it's more about working with what you've got. So if I was talking to someone who had just left an abusive relationship, I would certainly not recommend they go get in a new one in 2 weeks. But if that's what happens, I would rather not, judge that or say that's wrong. And I'd rather help support them see, is this new relationship going to work? And is it going to, are you going to be able to do the healing work you need to do while you're also dating? And so I think it's a good thing to look at kind of your energetic capacity and your just like predisposition as a human is like, do you have the energetic time and capacity and like, heart space even for a new relationship? Or not? Like, do you need to focus on yourself or maybe your friendships or other sources of love and connection in your life for now? So yeah, if I could go back, I would have definitely given myself more time, but it didn't happen that way. And like, I managed to do like all of my therapeutic work during a relationship. And that
Yeah.
happened because we just had really good boundaries. I had a lot of time for myself. I retained a lot of independence. So ultimately it all worked out the way it was meant to be. But yeah, I think it's different for everyone.
Yeah, I think my friends were surprised because I was like, yeah, I'm interested in dating again. And they're like, whoa, already? Like, I don't think anyone wanted to talk about it. It's just like, don't bring it up around
Yeah.
her yet. But I'm like, you guys don't realize, like, yeah, I left, a few months ago, but at the same time, I was being abused the entire time. Like, I checked out of that
Right.
relationship a long time ago.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
my heart was not in there.
Exactly.
So it was way
Exactly.
easier
It's
for me
very
to move on.
different than when you like, I think there's a different thing than if you're leaving an abusive relationship and then if you're just like left or you have to
Right.
leave a relationship that was healthy, but they broke your heart or something. Like getting over that heartbreak is a different process than processing abuse trauma. Like they're both,
Yeah.
real, but it's like when people think of like, how are you just moving on so quick? It's like, I moved on like years ago. Like I've been
Yeah.
over this. I've just been trying to survive. I didn't feel love for him for a long time. Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree. So, and you can answer this or not. Let me know if you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
But how soon did you share like your past experiences with your
Yeah.
new partner?
Yeah, I'm totally an open book. So I think the first time it came up was probably about 4 months into the relationship where I was like having a rough night or feeling like triggered by something and it just kind of came out in a very messy way, where I was just like, it wasn't like a regulated conversation. Like I was definitely crying and whatever. But I didn't give him all the details nearly, I just told him something about it and, he was very kind and compassionate and that was lovely. It was still really, a lot of vulnerability hangover with that or just feeling
Yeah.
like, oh, like what did I just do? But, all was well. And then I didn't end up telling him kind of the full story for like at least a year and a half into our relationship, which looking back if I started dating someone next week, I mean, now it's my job, so I'd probably tell them like on the first date, like in a very like, yeah, this is just a fact about me and my life. But at the time, it was so tender and so triggering to even talk about that I had to keep it close for a long time.
Right.
But like he knew I was in therapy, he knew I was focusing on my healing. Like I'd almost talk about healing pretty often, but he didn't actually know what happened in full detail. Like he knew I had an abusive relationship, but I didn't tell him what it was like.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how it happened for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's something that a lot of people worry about, you know, when thinking about their next partner, you know, what are they going to think? When do I need to tell them? And opening up is kind of hard, you know, at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you like you don't owe anyone your story. Like there's no reason you have to tell someone. Like I think it should totally come down to like your empowered choice and maybe like, you know, what's best for the relationship. So it's different for everyone, but like there's no reason you have to like, okay, in 3 months I need to like tell him my whole history. It's like why? Like you know, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. So how can we avoid self-sabotaging our next relationship that turns out to be healthy? You know, if you want to have a thriving, healthy relationship, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think kind of just getting acquainted with your trauma responses and how they show up in your relationship. So getting to understand like when you're triggered or upset or feeling scared, do you lash out and try to pick a fight, or you know you're more that fighter? Do you kind of run away and you're like, just get me out of here, and kind of like avoid all conflict and just try to like escape? Are you more of a fawn type where you're just gonna like start apologizing and crying, or like trying to make them happy and they're like, what? Like I was trying to just have a conversation, you know? That was me. And then are you more of like a freeze where you kind of like everything tenses up and you start dissociating and you aren't really present anymore? And you might be all of those or just some, but just starting to get familiar with how trauma shows up in your relationship, like how it's impacting it, and then doing some work around, you know, what can I do to help regulate myself in those moments? How can I communicate what's going on with me? What are the boundaries I need to feel safe enough in this relationship that is healthy? And I know that, but it's hard for me for some reason. So do I need more space? Do I need more connection? How can I ask for those things? Yeah, so those are just some examples, but kind of like being really prepared and honest about your experience just within yourself, and then sort of navigating the relationship with like that trauma-informed lens instead of just pretending to be fine if you're not.
Yeah, that's so important. Some people, I think they need that encouragement to go ahead and pursue a relationship, you know, without feeling that pressure of like, what if something bad happens, or what if I make something bad happen, you know, like you feel a little concerned about that. So yeah, that's a good point.
Sure.
Yeah. So is there anything else related to the topic of healing after an abusive relationship that we should mention?
I guess what I would just say is just like a reminder that, you know, healing is absolutely possible, and like your emotions matter, whether it's grief or anger or disgust or fear, like all of that matters, and you are not wrong for feeling the way you do. And all those things can point you towards where you need more attention, care, healing, support. So just know that there's people out there that, you know, are here for you and want to support you. And you deserve healthy relationships, and you deserve to feel safe in your body and all those good things.
Yeah. This is so helpful. And it's also helpful to see someone on the other side of it. You know, you've had that experience, you've been through healing, you're still healing, and that's totally fine. And, you know, it just makes you're normalizing it for everybody else, which I definitely appreciate.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So do you want to tell everyone about your course?
Yeah. So if you're feeling especially like you're struggling with relationships after trauma, I have a course out right now that I've been offering for the past 3 years called Blooming Relationships. And it's all about kind of all these things we've been talking about. So how to create and sustain healthy relationships when you've gone through something traumatic in the past. And you're noticing yourself having a hard time with things like trust, boundaries, communication, red flags, triggers, attachment styles, all that stuff. So it's open for enrollment enrollment until the end of September. But if people are listening to this later and you're interested, you can probably just email me and we'll figure it out.
Cool. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. And then do you want to go ahead and let people know where they can connect with you?
Yeah, so on social media, I'm at Blooming with Emmy on TikTok and Instagram, and my website is emmymarie.com, and I have a lot of like free resources. You can take that quiz we mentioned and find like my courses and my community and one-to-one coaching as well.
Perfect. Thanks for tuning in to the First Hustle Then Brunch podcast. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, I'd love if you subscribed and left us a review. Another way to support the podcast is to take a screenshot of this episode and share it on your Instagram story. Tag me at First Hustle Then Brunch so I can repost it. Thank you so much for supporting the show, and I'll see you in the next episode.